Um, Imagine discovering that a single missing hyphen in an English translation of an ancient manuscript could, accidentally turn you into a heretic,
That is quite a thought.
right? Or that a subtle grammatical choice made by a tired scribe 2,000 years ago drastically shifts how you view your own salvation today. Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking.
It is great to be here for this.
Yeah. So usually when we sit down to read an ancient text, we just read the English words on the page, and we assume we're getting the whole picture.
Oh, absolutely. We just take it for granted.
But today, we are doing a meticulous deep dive into the Net Bible First Edition notes on the first chapter of the book of Romans.
And we have some incredible sources for this. We are looking at translation notes, textual criticism data, and some really intense grammatical analyses.
Yeah, the mission today is to decode how translating ancient Greek into English reveals massive theological concepts about humanity, sin, and salvation. We're going to show you how a single grammatical choice alters our entire understanding of the text.
It is going to be a lot of fun.
Think of it like this. Reading these translation notes is like looking at the architectural blueprints of a house you have lived in for years.
I love that analogy.
You have walked down the same hallway 1,000 times, but suddenly, looking at the schematic, you see the hidden load-bearing walls.
Right. You realize why a certain pillar is there.
Yeah, and you understand the immense weight it holds up. That is what we are doing today with the grammar of Romans chapter 1.
It is a striking way to look at the text because, well, when you live in a house, you just take its structure for granted.
For sure.
When you read a letter in your native language, you take the phrasing for granted. But the Greek text of Romans is a masterpiece of theological engineering.
It really is.
Every single participle, every genitive noun, every missing word was placed there or omitted with deliberate intent.
So it is very calculated.
Very. And when we look at the notes the translators left behind, we get to see the actual math, so to speak, behind the theology.
That is fascinating.
We are going to see the absolute sovereignty of God and the reality of the human condition laid bare just by looking at how a few ancient Greek verbs and nouns interact.
So it removes the illusion that translation is just a simple, word-for-word math equation.
Precisely. It is a highly analytical process of weighing historical context, linguistic idioms, and theological consistency.
Well, right out of the gate, before we even get to the core message of this letter, we have to look at how the sender identifies himself.
Yes, the very first word.
And frankly, we have to look at the textual history of his very name. Because the first note in our sources points out something so simple, yet it shifts how you view the translation process.
Oh, the missing preposition.
Yeah. In Romans 1, verse 1, the English text almost always says, from Paul.
Right.
But the notes show us that the Greek text actually lacks the word from. It just says Paul.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah, the translator supplied the word from simply to make it readable for an English audience. That feels like a tiny detail, but it opens up a massive realization about what reading a translation actually means.
It really highlights an immediate challenge in bringing ancient Greek into modern English. Greek is, well, it is a highly inflected language.
What does that mean for the listener who has not studied Greek?
So it means the endings of the words often tell you the relationship between them. The ending of a noun tells you if it is the subject, the direct object, or if it indicates possession.
Oh, I see.
Because of this built-in directional system, Greek does not always need the helper words, the prepositions that English absolutely requires.
So English is just a bit more needy in that regard.
Yeah, pretty much. When a translator inserts a word like from, they are making a micro decision about readability.
They are building a bridge.
Exactly. They are trying to build a bridge between a first-century Mediterranean thought process and a 21st century Western mind. But those micro-decisions sometimes carry staggering theological weight, as we will see very shortly.
And the very next word introduces one of those massive concepts. Paul calls himself a doulos.
Yes, a very specific term.
Now, traditionally, you will see this rendered in English as servant, but our notes indicate that this is highly misleading for modern readers.
Very misleading.
The BDAG, which, is the standard Greek lexicon for biblical studies, notes that the word does not carry the connotation of a free individual functioning for another person.
Right. It's not a part-time job.
Not at all. It implies selling oneself into slavery. It is best translated as bondservant. So we're not talking about a hired employee here. We are talking about absolute ownership.
If we tie this to the larger context, a modern employee has autonomy. They have a contract.
Right, they can clock out at 5.
Exactly. They can quit if the working conditions are poor. A doulos, a bondservant, possesses no such autonomy.
So they're totally bound.
They have been purchased. Their time, their energy, their very bodily existence belongs entirely to their master.
That is a heavy concept.
It is. In the context of the theology we're looking at today, this points directly to the concept of being bought with a price. Paul is not volunteering his free time to God. He is acknowledging total, comprehensive ownership by God.
His entire life is a proprietary asset of the Creator.
That is a perfect way to put it.
I do want to clarify that concept for a modern audience, though, because the word slave carries horrific historical baggage for us.
Oh, absolutely.
Our immediate association is the brutal chattel slavery of recent centuries. But the notes provide crucial Old Testament background that reframes this entirely.
It is a completely different cultural framework.
Yeah. For a Jewish person in the first century, this title actually held immense honor. It did not connote drudgery or abuse.
Right, it was a badge of honor.
It was a title associated with national Israel in Isaiah chapter 43, and with massive historical figures. Moses, David, Elijah, they were all called the servants or bondservants of the Lord.
Heavy hitters of the faith.
Yeah, think of it less like being a hired employee who can quit any time, and more like being a sworn, lifelong envoy for a king.
I like that.
In that ancient context, your entire identity, your protection, and your status were completely absorbed into the king's household. Your authority came directly from the one who owned you.
So when Paul calls himself a doulos, he is claiming the mantle of Moses and David.
He is stepping to big shoes.
He really is. He is aligning himself with the great prophets who were totally consumed by the sovereign will of God.
Wow.
He is establishing his absolute submission, which, ironically, is the source of his absolute authority to write this letter.
That is a fascinating paradox.
He is saying, I am not coming to you with my own ideas. I'm coming to you as the purchased property and authorized spokesperson of the King of the universe.
That changes how the Roman Church has to receive his words.
It demands their attention immediately.
And regarding his words, I noticed an incredible linguistic puzzle in the opening lines regarding the manuscripts themselves.
Oh, the textual variant.
Yes. The notes mention a textual variant in verse 1. We have different ancient manuscripts that copy this letter. Some say Christ Jesus, and others say Jesus Christ.
It seems like such a minor flip.
It does. But our sources point out that Christ Jesus is the slightly more difficult reading, and therefore it is favored as the original text.
Textual criticism rules are so interesting.
They are. Because for someone who has never heard of textual criticism, the idea that a difficult reading is the right one sounds backward. You would assume the smoother text is the original.
It does sound counterintuitive at first glance, but textual criticism operates on a very realistic understanding of human psychology.
Oh, so?
Well, picture a scribe in a dimly lit room, copying manuscripts by hand for 10 or 12 hours a day.
Sounds exhausting.
It was. Jesus Christ was the far more common expression in the early church. It just rolled off the tongue.
Right.
If the original text said Christ Jesus, a tired scribe is highly likely to accidentally flip it to the more familiar Jesus Christ in their head as their quill hits the parchment.
Oh, so muscle memory takes over.
Spot on. They tend to smooth things out either accidentally or intentionally to make the text read more conventionally.
That makes total sense.
Scribes rarely take a normal, smooth phrase and make it awkward. Therefore, the difficult reading is often the original because it explains why the later variations exist. They were subconscious or conscious attempts to fix or normalize it.
So Christ Jesus is the winner here.
Yeah, plus the data shows Paul has a distinct fondness for the order Christ Jesus in his letters, particularly Romans, Galatians, and Philippians.
That is so cool. And that brings us to another grammatical puzzle right in the same sentence. Paul says he is set apart for the gospel of God.
Ah, the genitives.
Yes. In English, that sounds completely straightforward.
Yeah.
But the Greek uses a genitive construction that gives translators a serious headache.
It is a massive debate.
The notes lay out the debate. Is it a subjective genitive, meaning the gospel which God brings? Or is it an objective genitive, meaning the gospel about God?
Both sound plausible.
Our sources suggest it could be a plenary genitive, where both are intended, but they slightly prefer the subjective. We need to define these terms. Let us start with the difference between a subjective and objective genitive.
Sure. So a genitive case in Greek usually shows possession or relationship, often translated with the word of in English.
Okay.
But of can mean several different things. Think of the phrase, the painting of my father.
Okay, I am picturing it.
Does that mean the painting that my father painted with his own hands?
Like he is the artist.
Right. That would be a subjective genitive where the father is the subject doing the action.
Got it.
Or does it mean a portrait showing my father's face?
Where he's the model.
Yes. That would be an objective genitive where the father is the object being depicted.
Oh, that makes it very clear.
So when Paul says the gospel of God, the subjective genitive means God is the subject doing the action. He is the author bringing the good news.
Okay.
The objective genitive means God is the object of the good news. The news is about him.
And what about the plenary genitive?
A plenary genitive is a fascinating concept discussed by scholars like M. Zerwick. It suggests that the author deliberately used an ambiguous phrasing because he fully intended both meanings simultaneously.
So Paul meant both on purpose.
Exactly. The gospel which God brings is, in fact, the very gospel about himself. It is a full, robust, dual meaning.
However, the notes indicate a slight preference for the subjective genitive here, the gospel which God brings.
Which fits the wider theology perfectly.
It makes total sense within a framework that views salvation as entirely initiated by God. It is his gospel. He owns it.
He is the architect.
Yeah, he authored it from eternity past, and he is the one actively bringing it into the world. It does not originate with man's clever ideas. It is divine rescue mission initiated by the Creator.
Which sets the stage perfectly for what follows.
So,
If God is the author of this message, the text must immediately pivot to the central figure of that message. Yes. This requires precise, highly specific language about his nature. And that is where we see the grammar doing some incredibly heavy lifting regarding the incarnation.
look at verse 3. It uses the idiom born of the seed and according to the flesh.
It's a very specific phrase.
The translators note that this indicates Jesus' earthly life, and it specifically references human weakness. What caught my eye is that by stating he came according to the flesh, the text strongly implies he was more than human.
It creates a boundary.
Right, because if he were just a guy, it would have been sufficient just to say he was a descendant of David.
If I tell you that my friend David is human, you would look at me like I am crazy because it is entirely redundant.
Right, I would say obviously he is human.
You only specify that someone exists according to the flesh if there is another dimension to their existence.
Oh, that is a great point.
The grammar forces us to reckon with the incarnation. The eternal Son took on human flesh, entering into the frailty, the hunger, the exhaustion, and the weakness of the human condition.
He really stepped into our mess.
He did. The phrase, according to the flesh, acts as a boundary marker for his earthly ministry.
And the contrast to that boundary marker comes in the very next verse, which contains a massive translation trap.
This one is huge.
Verse 4 says, he was, depending on your translation, declared or appointed the Son of God. The Greek word here is horizo.
Yes, horizo.
The notes are adamant that horizo means to determine or appoint. But the translators use a heavily hyphenated phrase to protect the theology. They translate it as Son of God in might.
They had to be very careful there.
Why is translating horizo so dangerous if we do not use those hyphens?
This takes us back to the history of early church heresies.
Oh boy.
Yeah. There was a heresy called adoptionism, which claimed that Jesus was just a normal human who was so exceptionally righteous that God adopted or appointed him to become the divine son at his baptism or his resurrection.
Wow, so denying his eternal divinity.
Exactly. If you translate verse 4 as he was appointed the Son of God by the resurrection, you risk supporting that heresy.
That is dangerous.
It makes it sound like he was not the Son beforehand, but only achieved that status after he rose from the dead.
But the notes are clear that the word horizo literally means to determine or appoint. It is where we get the English word horizon, the determining boundary between the earth and the sky.
That is a great visual.
You cannot just change the dictionary definition of the verb because it makes you uncomfortable theologically.
You hit the nail on the head. The Greek term is used 8 times in the New Testament, always meaning to determine or appoint. The translators cannot massage the verb.
So what do?
Instead, they look closely at the structure of the whole sentence. Paul is not saying Jesus was appointed to be the Son of God.
Okay.
He is saying Jesus was appointed to a specific phase of his eternal sonship, Son of God in might.
Oh, so the hyphenation groups it together.
Yes. That entire phrase functions as a single title.
Yeah.
Prior to the resurrection, he was the Son of God in weakness, according to the flesh.
Yeah.
At the resurrection, he crossed a horizon line. He was appointed to a new public phase of his eternal reality, the Son of God in might, or an absolute, unquestionable authority.
That changes everything.
It mirrors Matthew 28 perfectly, where the resurrected Christ announces, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me."
That shift in function and public vindication, rather than a change in his eternal nature, is a brilliant distinction.
It really is.
Now, in that same verse, Paul mentions the Spirit of holiness. The notes state that some interpreters take this to refer to Christ's own inner spirit, not necessarily the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity.
Yes, that is a debated point.
I have to push back on this phrasing. If it refers to his own inner human spirit, why use such a specific, almost clunky phrase like Spirit of holiness instead of just saying His Holy Spirit? It feels intentionally distinct.
It does feel clunky in English, but it is actually a very Semitic way of speaking functioning within a Greek text.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Hebrew idioms often use a noun to describe a characteristic rather than an adjective. But contrasting it with the flesh in the previous verse is the key to unlocking it. Verse 3 talks about his physical lineage, his flesh, characterized by weakness and subjection to the fallen world.
Right. His humanity.
Verse 4 talks about his inner life, characterized by absolute unblemished holiness. Even while dwelling in weak human flesh, his inner spirit remained flawlessly holy and separate from sin.
So it highlights the absolute purity of his inner life, contrasting with the frail, decaying flesh of his human lineage. It is a striking juxtaposition.
It is a beautiful way to describe the incarnation.
And the notes also mention that the resurrection spoken of here could be his own resurrection, or it could be translated by resurrection of the dead, referring to the general resurrection at the end of the age, of which Jesus' resurrection is just the first installment.
The grammar allows for both, and again, we might be looking at a deliberate double meaning.
Like the plenary genitive we talked about earlier.
Precisely. Christ's resurrection is not an isolated incident. As Paul outlines in 1 Corinthians 15, Christ is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep.
Right.
His resurrection triggers the mechanism for the final resurrection of all who are in him. When he rose, the guarantee of the general resurrection was set in stone.
Establishing precisely who Christ is and what he accomplished leads directly to what Christ demands of the audience.
The practical application.
Yeah. In verse 5, Paul talks about receiving grace and apostleship. When I first read that, I assumed he was listing two different things he received.
That is how it sounds in English.
But the translation notes call this a hendiatus. This was a new term for me, and I realized it changes the entire flavor of his calling.
A hendiatus is a fascinating rhetorical device.
Can you break that down?
Sure. It is a figure of speech where two words connected by "and" are used to express a single complex idea.
Okay, give me an example.
Instead of saying, "I drank from a cup in gold," you mean, "I drank from a golden cup."
Oh, I see.
So when Paul says grace and apostleship, he does not mean he received two separate deliveries from God, a generic box of grace and a separate box containing the office of apostleship.
He means he received the specific grace of apostleship.
Exactly. It is the unmerited favor of God manifesting specifically as his calling to be an apostle to the Gentiles.
That makes the calling itself an act of grace.
It sure does.
But the real debate is in the very next phrase. Paul says his goal is to bring about the obedience of faith.
Oh, this is a massive grammatical puzzle.
The notes outline 4 distinct possibilities for this genitive phrase, and each one drastically alters the expectation placed on the reader.
It really dictates how you live out your theology.
I want to spend some time here because this phrase is crucial. The first option is an objective genitive. Obedience to the Christian faith.
In that view, the faith is seen as a formal body of doctrine.
Like a set of rules.
Right. It is the objective truth of Christianity, the historical facts and theological claims. So obedience of faith means submitting your mind and your life to the teachings of the Christian religion. You are obeying the established rule of faith. It is external truth that you are aligning yourself with.
Okay, the second option is a subjective genitive. The obedience that faith produces. Think of this like an apple tree.
I like this analogy.
The faith is the root system and the trunk, and the obedience is the apples.
That is a highly favored view among many commentators. Faith is the engine.
Right.
You truly believe the promises of God, and because of that genuine internal belief, your external actions naturally begin to align with God's will.
So the fruit just happens.
True faith always yields the byproduct of obedience. It is impossible to have the root without eventually seeing the fruit.
The third option is an attributive genitive, believing obedience. This feels more descriptive of the action itself.
Yes, it is a quality.
If the second option was the tree producing the apple, this option is describing the flavor of the apple.
That is a great way to put it. It describes the specific quality of the obedience God desires.
So it is not just blind rule following.
Right. It is not a legalistic, grudging submission to rules because you are terrified of punishment. It is an obedience characterized by an attitude of trust and belief. You obey because you inherently trust the one giving the command.
And the fourth option is a genitive of apposition, obedience, namely faith.
This one is profound, striking.
I want you to think about a phrase like the joy of running. Is it the joy that running produces after you finish? Or is it the joy found inside the act itself?
Like the running itself is the joy.
Yeah. Is the running itself the joy? If we use a genitive of apposition here, Paul is saying that the very act of believing God is, in itself, the supreme act of obedience. Faith is the obedience he is looking for.
Within a reformed framework where humans are entirely incapable of earning their salvation through moral works, that fourth option hits a very heavy chord.
Because it removes the works.
Completely. The singular requirement God places upon us for justification is to believe his promises. To trust him is to obey his primary command.
Which option do the scholars land on?
Well, of course, some scholars suggest Paul was deliberately ambiguous here to encompass all these ideas.
Oh, like the plenary genitive again.
Yes. True faith is the obedience God demands. It inevitably produces moral obedience. It is characterized by belief, and it submits to the external body of Christian doctrine.
It is a theological diamond. Whichever way you turn it, you see a different facet of the truth.
That is a beautiful way to phrase it.
And Paul clarifies exactly who he is calling to this multifaceted obedience. Verse 6 says, among whom you also are called.
A very specific audience.
The grammar here connects you also back to all the Gentiles in verse 5. This proves that the Roman church at this specific time was predominantly Gentile.
Which is critical historical context for reading the rest of the letter.
Give us some of that background.
The Roman Church was likely founded by Jewish believers who returned from Pentecost in Jerusalem. But later, the Emperor Claudius expelled all Jews from Rome because of riots.
Oh, wow.
The Jewish Christians had to leave, leaving the Gentile Christians to run the church for years. When Claudius died and the Jews were finally allowed to return, they found a church that had developed entirely Gentile customs.
I can imagine that caused some tension.
Immense cultural friction regarding food laws, holy days, and circumcision. Paul establishes right out of the gate, you Gentiles are part of my specific apostolic jurisdiction, and I have authority to speak into this situation.
That specific jurisdiction explains his intense desire to visit them. We see Paul's eagerness mapped out through specific structural cues in his writing.
The structure is so revealing.
First off, verses 1 through 7 actually form a massive, broken sentence structure in the Greek.
It is basically a giant run-on sentence.
Yeah. Paul starts his thought, inserts clause after clause about the gospel, about Jesus, about his apostleship, and finally lands the sentence. And then in verse 8, he says, first, I thank my God.
But he never gets to second.
No. The notes point out a humorous detail. Paul never actually gives a second point. J.B. Phillips even translated it, I must begin by telling you, because the secondly never arrives.
It is a brilliant glimpse into the reality of ancient letter writing. Paul was not typing this on a word processor where he could easily edit, hit backspace, and restructure his bullet points.
He could not just delete the word first.
Right. He was dictating to a scribe, a man named Tertius. You can almost picture Paul pacing the room, overflowing with theological zeal.
Pacing and just going off on a tangent.
He says, first of all, and then he gets so caught up in the majesty of what God is doing in Rome and his desperate desire to see them that he completely forgets to offer a second point. The sheer passion disrupts his own grammatical outline.
I love that human element. In verse 11, he says he longs to see them so he can impart some spiritual gift to make them strong.
People often misunderstand this.
Yeah, a lot of modern readers immediately think of the gifts of the Spirit like prophecy, healing, or speaking in tongues.
Which is not what he means here.
The notes clarify that this is a metonymy of cause for effect. He does not mean he is going to lay hands on them and hand them a superpower.
He is not passing out spiritual abilities.
No, he means he is going to use his own spiritual gifts, like teaching, exhortation, and apostolic insight, to build them up. The cause is his gift. The effect is their edification.
And notice how quickly he balances that pastoral authority with staggering humility in verse 12.
He really lowers himself.
He immediately adds that he wants to be mutually comforted by their faith. He is an apostle, the designated representative of Christ, but he recognizes that the faith of these Roman believers, whose reputation has spread throughout the whole civilized world, will minister to him just as much as his teaching will minister to them.
It is a beautiful picture of the interdependency of the church.
Everyone needs everyone else.
To emphasize how serious he is about this visit, verse 13 uses a classic Pauline signal. I do not want you to be unaware, or, in older translations, I would not have you ignorant.
It is his trademark phrase.
The notes show he uses this precise phrase in 1 Corinthians 10, 1 Thessalonians 4, and elsewhere. It is his consistent neon sign flashing, signaling that something vital is about to be said.
Pay attention, basically.
Yeah. He calls them brothers, which the Greek lexicon BDAG confirms was a standard term for brothers and sisters, or fellow Christians, showing his familial bond with them, despite having never visited their city.
His eagerness reaches an absolute peak in verse 15, where he says, I'm eager to preach the gospel to you.
The Greek word there is interesting.
It is. The Greek word for eager here is prothumos. What is utterly fascinating is that the only other place this specific word is used in the entire New Testament is by Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he tells his disciples, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Wait, the spirit is prothumos.
Yes.
That connects Paul's zeal to preach in Rome with a recognizable, intense spiritual agony and readiness.
It is a massive connection.
Jesus was facing the cross, facing the wrath of God, and his spirit was fiercely ready to accomplish the Father's will despite the crushing weakness of the flesh. Paul uses that same rare word to describe his readiness to march into the capital of the pagan empire to preach a crucified Jewish carpenter.
It connects his apostolic zeal directly to the agonizing, obedient zeal of Christ.
He knew it was risky.
Paul knows going to Rome is dangerous. He knows it might cost him his freedom and eventually his life. But his spirit is prothumos. He's compelled by an obligation, a debt he owes to both Greeks and barbarians, to deliver the message of salvation regardless of the personal cost.
That intense readiness hits a climax when he finally states the central thesis of his entire letter.
The turning point.
If there is a load-bearing wall in the book of Romans, it is verse 17. This single verse was the epicenter of the Protestant Reformation.
It really was.
Paul says the gospel is the authority of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. And the notes clarify that in this context, Gentile or Greek simply refers to anyone who is not Jewish.
Right, it is a universal statement.
But then we hit the phrase that changed human history. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed. The notes detail 3 massive debates over what the righteousness of God actually means here.
This is where we really need to dig in.
Let us break these down because they define how we view our standing before the Creator.
The first view sees the righteousness of God as a genitive of source.
Meaning what?
It means a righteous status that comes from God. In this view, righteousness is a gift. You are unrighteous, bankrupt, and guilty. But God hands you a status of righteousness, placing it onto your account.
So it is not my own goodness.
No, it is an alien righteousness, external to you, provided by the judge himself.
Okay, the second view is the subjective genitive. This sees righteousness as God's act of making someone righteous or justifying them.
It shifts the focus slightly from the gift itself to the action of the giver.
Like a courtroom scene.
Exactly. It is God's active intervention in the courtroom of heaven, banging the gavel and declaring the guilty sinner to be fully vindicated and just. It is God acting righteously to save his people, keeping his covenant promises.
And the third view is the possessive genitive. This sees the righteousness of God simply as an attribute of God himself. It is God's own intrinsic moral perfection being put on display.
And historically, those who adhere to Reformed theology, drawing heavily from the insights of Luther and Calvin, have heavily leaned into a combination of the first two.
Because the third one is terrifying.
Yes, the terrifying reality of the third view, that the gospel just reveals God's perfect moral standard, is what drove Martin Luther to absolute despair as a monk.
Because he could never meet the standard.
Right. If the gospel just shows how perfect God is, it is terrible news for sinners because we can never, ever measure up to it. It just condemns us more clearly.
It would be a crushing weight.
But when Luther realized the grammatical possibility that this righteousness is a status given by God, an alien righteousness credited to our account through faith alone, the text opened up like the gates of paradise.
It became good news.
The gospel is good news precisely because the righteousness required by God is the righteousness provided by God.
And the mechanism for receiving that provided righteousness is right there in the next phrase, from faith to faith. The Greek is ik pistios eis pistin.
That phrase has sparked so much discussion.
The translation notes explain that this implies righteousness is obtained by faith because it was specifically designed for faith. I love to think of this like a lock and a key.
Walk us through that.
The salvation mechanism, the lock, was designed specifically for the exact shape of faith. It was not designed for the shape of good works, or the shape of genetic heritage, or the shape of intellectual brilliance.
It only takes one type of key.
That is why faith and faith alone is the only key that turns the lock.
God structured the economy of salvation so that all human boasting is entirely excluded.
Because you didn't pick the lock, you just used the key provided.
If the lock accepted the key of human effort, we could take credit for opening the door. We could pat ourselves on the back for being moral enough to earn it.
Which is exactly what human nature wants to do.
Right. By designing it strictly for faith, which is essentially an empty hand receiving a gift from someone else, God ensures that he gets all the glory for the salvation of the sinner.
It is brilliant.
And Paul backs this up immediately by quoting the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk, "The righteous shall live by faith." He is proving to his Jewish readers that this is not a new invention. This has always been God's design from the very beginning.
But that brilliant light of justification by faith needs a dark backdrop to be fully understood.
The contrast is coming.
Paul immediately pivots to reveal the terrifying background against which this glorious righteousness shines, the reality of human rebellion.
Verse 18.
Verse 18 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men." The notes indicate that against all ungodly people uses an attributed genitive, and scholar C.E.B. Cranfield points out that this specifically targets all people, Jews included.
This is a vital structural note for the whole letter. Paul is about to launch into a devastating, prolonged critique of pagan Gentile culture.
Which the Jewish readers would love.
The Jewish readers in Rome would be nodding along, cheering him on, agreeing with every harsh assessment of the Roman world around them.
But it is a trap.
The grammar here sets a trap. All ungodly and unrighteous people is universally inclusive. Paul is slowly tightening the net.
Oh, wow.
In chapters 2 and 3, he will spring the trap and show the Jewish believers that despite their law and their heritage, they are caught in the exact same net of total depravity. No human being escapes this diagnosis.
The text says these people suppress the truth by means of unrighteousness. Their unrighteousness is the instrument, the tool they use to hold down the truth.
Like holding a beach ball underwater.
Yeah, and verses 19 and 20 declare that the truth of God is manifest in them, leaving them without excuse. This is the core concept of general revelation.
God is clearly seen.
God's existence and eternal authority are so clearly displayed in the created order that humanity's ignorance is not a lack of information. It is a willful, aggressive suppression.
It is an act of hostility against the Creator. We do not drift away from God accidentally because we just did not have enough data.
We push him away on purpose.
We push him away intentionally because we love our unrighteousness. We use our sin as a heavyweight to hold down the truth that is screaming at us from every sunset, every mountain range, and the internal testimony of our own conscience.
We just refuse to look at it.
We hold it underwater because we do not want to submit to the one who made us.
And verse 22 describes the psychological result of that suppression. Professing to be wise, they became fools.
There is an interesting grammatical note there.
Yeah, the notes point out a concessive participle here, although they profess to be wise. Despite their claims of high intellect, their advanced philosophy, and their societal sophistication, they are engaged in absolute absurdity.
And that absurdity reaches its peak in verse 23.
This is one of the most tragic and brilliant linguistic moments in the entire text. Paul says they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man. The Greek words here are aphthartos for incorruptible and phthartos for corruptible.
The phonetic similarity is unmistakable. Athakos, phthos.
They sound almost identical.
You can hear the wordplay in the Greek. Paul is using the sound of the words to mock the sheer stupidity of idolatry.
It highlights how foolish it is.
You had the Aphthartos, the immortal, infinite, unfading, undecaying creator of the cosmos, and you traded him for the Sartos, something that rots, decays, and eventually turns to dust.
What a terrible trade.
This is a direct allusion to Psalm 106, where the text says, Israel traded the glory of God for the image of a grass-eating ox.
We read about ancient people carving statues out of wood or stone, and we think of idolatry as an ancient, primitive mistake.
We think we are past that.
Yeah, we think we have outgrown it with our technology and our modern sensibilities. But framing it as trading the immortal for the decaying makes it an incredibly modern problem.
It applies perfectly today.
We might not carve wooden statues, but look at what we worship. We worship youth and beauty, which are actively decaying. We worship money, which decays due to inflation or market crashes.
We worship our careers.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. We worship political might, which is entirely subject to decay and shifting cultural winds. We treat decaying things as if they are immortal. We ask things that are rotting to give us eternal security.
And that is the essence of human depravity. Our minds are so thoroughly darkened by our active suppression of the truth that we genuinely believe the decaying things will give us lasting satisfaction.
We trick ourselves.
We are bankrupting our souls to purchase ashes. We look at the Thartos, the infinite God who offers himself to us, and we say, no thank you, and we grasp desperately at the Phlartos, the fleeting things that will slip through our fingers the moment we die.
When humanity makes that terrible trade, what does God do? This leads directly to God's response.
The judgment.
The grammar here maps out a historical and societal collapse. Verse 24 says, therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity. The notes show this is an allusion to Psalm 81, verse 12, where God says, so I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own devices.
This concept of God giving them over is terrifying.
It really is.
We often think of God's wrath as him actively striking people down with lightning bolts or sending immediate catastrophic judgment.
Like a fire and brimstone event.
Right. But the text reveals a different kind of wrath. It is a wrath of abandonment.
Just letting go.
God simply removes the restraints. He stops striving with the rebellious heart, steps back and says, you want to pursue your sin. You want to worship the corruptible. I will let you have exactly what you are asking for.
I want to look at the grammar of the next phrase because the notes show it is highly debated. God gave them over to dishonor their bodies among themselves.
Ah, the infinitive.
Yeah, the notes say that the Greek infinitive to atomazestai can be taken three ways. As an infinitive of purpose, an infinitive of result, or an explanatory infinitive.
Those are very different meanings.
Let us think about the difference between purpose and result here. If it is an infinitive of purpose, the degradation is God's active goal in handing them over.
Right, like he is pushing them into it.
If it is an infinitive of result, the degradation is simply the inevitable crash when the brakes are removed. Think of a car parked on a steep hill. Does God physically push the car down the hill, or does he just take his foot off the brake pedal?
Within a reformed understanding of God's sovereignty and human responsibility, the result view is incredibly compelling.
Because the car wants to roll down anyway.
Yes. God does not need to inject fresh evil into the human heart to cause degradation. The human heart is already a factory of idols, as John Calvin famously said.
We manufacture our own ruin.
When God removes the common grace that restrains human wickedness, the inevitable, catastrophic result is that humans will dishonor themselves. They will plunge down the hill the moment the brake is lifted. Gravity does the work. Sin does the work.
They traded the truth of God for the lie, verse 25 says. And this leads to verses 26 and 27, which detail the abandonment of natural functions.
This is where society starts to fracture.
The Greek term krisis is used here, which the lexicon defines strictly as sexual relations. The text describes males and females abandoning natural krisis for that which is contrary to nature and burning with intense desire for one another.
It is important to note how objectively the grammatical notes handle this. Paul is diagnosing the societal symptoms of a theological disease.
Cause and effect.
When a culture rejects the Creator, when they fundamentally flip the vertical axis of worship exchanging God for the creature, the horizontal axis of human relationships inevitably flips as well.
The whole structure tilts.
The abandonment of the Creator's design for worship leads directly as a symptom to the abandonment of the Creator's design for human flourishing and physical relations. It is a direct chain of cause and effect presented in the grammar. You cannot unmoor the ship from the dock and expect it to stay in the harbor.
Because they did not approve to have God in their knowledge. Verse 28 says God gave them over to a reprobate or disqualified mind to do the things that are improper.
The mind itself becomes broken.
And this triggers a massive shift in the text. Verse 29 moves from the phrase having been filled to a rapid-fire list of specific actions. This is known as a vice list.
These are intense to read through.
The notes provide excellent context here. Vice lists were actually very common in the New Testament. We see them in Galatians 5 and 1 Timothy 1, and they're also common in intertestamental literature, like the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 14.
The structure of a vice list is designed to overwhelm the reader.
It feels like an avalanche.
Paul is piling up the evidence. He lists malice, envy, murder, strife, deceit. He calls them gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents.
It just keeps going.
He uses a string of terms that translate to foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless, or, as the translation notes render it, promise breakers.
That covers basically every area of life.
He is demonstrating that the rejection of God does not just lead to a few isolated bad habits. It leads to a comprehensive fracturing of the human soul and the collapse of all social order. Every sphere of life, from the public square to the private home, is poisoned by the initial rejection of the aphthartos God.
Which brings us to the devastating conclusion of the chapter in verse 32.
The bottom of the spiral.
Paul says, although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them.
It is chilling.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, drawing strictly from this progression in verse 32. The translation notes highlight a terrifying three-step escalation of human rebellion.
Walk us through those 3 steps.
First, there is the intellectual reality, knowing God's decree, knowing that these actions lead to death. Second, there is the behavioral reality, ignoring the decree and committing the acts anyway.
And the 3rd step is even worse.
Yeah, the 3rd step is the absolute bottom of the downward spiral, actively approving of others who do them. Why is mutual approval placed as the ultimate peak of human rebellion?
That is a great question.
Does creating a society of mutual approval insulate us from the guilt of the corruptible things we just discussed? It suggests that the climax of human rebellion isn't just the sinful action itself. It is the desperate desire to rewrite the moral rules entirely and to applaud others for following the new script.
If everyone else is doing it, we feel justified.
Right. If we can get everyone around us to clap for the decay, maybe we won't hear the crumbling of our own foundations. Think about that as you review the sources for yourself. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the source material.